Hey, okay, we're on to Dad's book. So, stories from my life, Brad E. Jensen. And we've got some awesome stuff in here. Grandparents, my parents, letter to my mom, my first job, my career, my first marathon, rules to live by, all kinds of good stuff. So, let's get started. The introduction. My purpose in publishing this book is to give my children a glimpse of my childhood, growing up years, and a couple of stories from later years, in the hope that they will know me much better. As I have attended funerals and listened to the stories told, I have discovered how much more you can learn about a person, their personalities, interests, and hobbies, and other areas of their life that help you know them much better. So, without waiting to learn this at my funeral, herein are some of your dad's stories. I want to thank Erica and John for subscribing to us to Storyworth. This has allowed us a much less difficult way of accomplishing this objective. Also, special thanks to Corky for working with me for years with interviews, videos, and her endless journal entries on my life. I dedicate this to my wonderful children, Chini, Corky, Kip, Todd, Erica, Heidi, Tracy, Angie, Ashley, Paul, and Lindsay. And then here's these pictures of everybody. And it says below, family is everything. Okay, chapter 1, my grandparents. And it's a little bit of a doozy here. My paternal and maternal grandparents were very different from each other. My paternal grandparents, David and Bessie Pierce Jensen, were both raised in the Mormon polygamous colony of Colonia Diaz, Mexico, whereas my maternal grandparents, Walter and Bessie Morse Riggin, were both raised in the western part of the state of Wisconsin. Each set of grandparents knew their future spouses from childhood. David and Bessie Jensen, along with their entire community, were driven out to Mexico by Pancho Villa and his band of rebels. David spent his early adulthood shoeing horses and mules for the U.S. Army in El Paso, Texas. Bessie and her family moved to El Paso, Texas, where her grandfather was operating a sawmill at the time. It was there that their paths crossed again, and after spending time together and then apart, they were finally married on the 25th of January, 1922, in the Salt Lake Temple. Just get some water quickly. My paternal grandparents, Walter and Bessie Morse Riggin, began to date when they came of age and were married in Washburn, Wisconsin on the 17th of March, 1921. Of all my grandparents, the one that I knew the least was my grandpa Riggin. When my siblings and I were still young, in our preteen years, we traveled at least once, sometimes twice a year, to Spokane, where my mother was raised and where her parents lived out the rest of their lives. On those visits, I remember Grandpa Riggin being very quiet and reserved, and therefore I didn't really know him personally. It was later, after he passed away, that I studied his life and learned much about him. He passed away before his time from a blood clot passing his lungs and heart. To his lungs and heart. At the time, we had just arrived in Spokane with the plans of going on to Seattle World's Fair after visiting for a couple of days with Grandpa and Grandma Riggin. When we arrived, we learned that Grandpa Riggin had been taken to the hospital that night before for some tests that they needed to take. I'm not sure for what reason. So that evening, my mom and dad went to the hospital with Grandma Riggin to visit him. Mom told me later that they had a good visit and were on their way leaving when Mom had this strong impression to go back and tell Grandpa how much she loved him. The next morning, we kids were all sitting in the car, anxious to get out on our way to the Seattle World's Fair. While Mom and Dad were saying their last goodbyes to Grandma, we suddenly heard this loud crying and a lot of commotion from inside the house. Grandpa Riggin's doctor had come to the front door of the house when he came in, he put his arms around Grandma and told her that Walter had died suddenly last night when some blood clots had gone to his lungs and heart. I remembered how inconsolable Grandma Riggin was. He had been her best friend all her life, and to lose him suddenly with no warning must have been a terrible shock with emotional trauma. He was only 61 years old at that time. Oh, that's young. I was very close to Grandma Riggin. She became very involved in her grandkids' lives, especially soon after Grandpa Riggin's death. She was very short, barely 5 feet. She was very opinionated and always spoke her mind. It didn't seem to bother anyone because she was wise and almost always right, but mostly because she made sure you knew she loved you. I remember getting a large box in the mail each year just before Christmas. There was a present for each member of the family. She did that for years until her posterity was so large that she just couldn't possibly do it anymore. One memory of Grandma Riggin that still makes me smile when I think about it occurred when I was having breakfast one morning at her place. I was around 17 at the time, and Grandma was quite worried about my independence, so to speak. She knelt down by our chairs for morning prayer to bless the food. As Grandma prayed, prayer was closing, and what seemed like a second thought, she said, "And Lord, please bless Brad with his problems in his life." There was more, but I don't remember the exact words. Mom was beside herself and not well pleased over it because she thought that wasn't proper in a prayer with the person kneeling there. I had a big grin on my face when I got back to my chair. That was just Grandma Riggin, and I loved her. She was without guile. Grandma passed away on the 4th of October, 1989 in Spokane, Washington. She was 87 years old. I knew both of my paternal grandparents very well because they lived only 3 miles down the road from us in St. Ignatius, Montana. My grandpa Jensen had turned most of his acreage over to my father. They worked together for much of my childhood. Grandpa was always there when we were branding cattle, moving them 10 miles away to summer pasture, getting the field ready for planting, or harvesting the grain and or alfalfa hay for the dairy cattle. He was quiet on one hand, but on the other, he spoke often to me about any number of things. I remember thinking always how wise he was. He seemed to know everything about the Book of Mormon and the Gospel of Jesus Christ. He was an incredibly hard worker, and as he aged, he didn't seem to slow down much. He was so well thought of by everyone in our small town. He was the branch president in St. Ignatius for 17 years. I was told many times how caring he was to everyone. He was always helping someone out. Grandpa and Grandma Jensen moved from Pocatello, Idaho, where he had worked for the railroad. Soon after they were married in St. Ignatius, Montana, around 1930, he had saved every penny to buy a farm in this fertile valley that Grandma Pierce Jensen's parents, Neil and Georgiana Adams Pierce, had moved on. They eventually came to the St. Ignatius Valley with 3 children at the time and bought a 160-acre farm and ranch. They prospered raising sugar beets and beef cattle. Sugar beet harvesting was backbreaking work back then. After a few years, Grandpa changed his crop acres from sugar beets to wheat, which was going for $2.50 a bushel a few years before World War II. This was a good price at the time. To be in the business of raising wheat, you needed a threshing machine back then, before the days of combines. The threshing machine, like the combine, separated the wheat from the stalk, and unlike the combines, was stationary. You had to bring the cut wheat, stalk and all, to the threshing machine and feed it. The threshing machine was expensive, so my grandfather, along with 3 other farmers in the town, decided to buy a threshing machine, with each of them contributing equally to the financing. It was after the second season of harvest, with the next note due for payment, that several of the farmers said that they could not afford to make their payment. They all, except for David Jensen, decided to let the machine go back to the bank. David did not feel that was an option and took over the payments and the ownership of the threshing machine. Many years later, he was told by one of the bankers, "It was because your name was on the note in the first place that we had agreed to the loan on the threshing machine. And true to your name, when it came to making sure that it never went to default, you made the payments." That was one of the many stories of the goodness and the integrity of Grandpa Jensen. I always knew my Grandpa Jensen very well. He was a true farm or ranch wife. I also knew my Grandma Jensen very well. She was a true farm or ranch wife, having been raised that way by her parents, although she did very little field work. However, my Grandma Jensen, Bessie Pierce Jensen, was a real cowgirl at heart. Her aim was deadly. Many a pheasant was shot by Grandma Jensen's kitchen window, from Grandma Jensen's kitchen window with her .22 caliber single-shot rifle, finding its way to the supper table that night. Those summer days in Montana were often filled with lazy afternoons between hay cuttings. I would sometimes nap on a little spring bed frame underneath the maple trees that framed the front lawn of my grandparents' place. They were on the original home place about 2 miles down the country road from ours. On one such lazy afternoon, Grandma came out through the back porch and walked over to where I was napping. She asked if I was hungry. The answer was always yes. She said that she would be back with some fried cottontail rabbit that would be better tasting than any chicken I'd ever eaten. I dozed back off, but was suddenly awakened by the crack of her .22 caliber rifle. As I sat up on the bed spring and looked towards where the sound had originated, Grandma suddenly emerged from the back of the house with a rifle cradled in her arms and a small rabbit in her left hand. It seemed the little critter was eating from some of Grandma's garden. Like the pheasant, he found himself on Grandma's menu for the day. And in case you were wondering how it tasted, she was right. Better than any fried chicken I had ever eaten. After Grandpa and Grandma Jensen aged, they bought a home in Mesa, Arizona, and began traveling back and forth from Mesa and St. Ignatius, spending the cold winter months in Arizona. They made the trip in their 1956 Chevy pickup because they always came back in the spring loaded with citrus fruits for the ward members, including our family. I have memories of watching down the country road every day, waiting for them to come after learning that they were on their way. Sooner or later, they'd show up in their cream-colored pickup loaded with citrus fruit. They themselves loved grapefruit with sugar piled high on each triangle. Grandpa Jensen was the first one of them to pass away. He was 86 years old and passed from natural causes of old age. I was in Italy at the time, serving on a NATO site of the U.S. Army. Late one evening, someone from the base came to our apartment with a telegram from my father telling me that Grandpa had quietly passed earlier that morning. I remember how sad I was. I loved him very much. Grandma Jensen passed away 4 years later in 1981. I was back from Italy and attending college at the time. Both she and Grandpa Jensen, as well as Grandpa and Grandma Rigdon, were wonderful grandparents. They were all good, honest, hardworking people that loved the Lord and tried hard to live their lives that way. I really do feel fortunate to be a direct descendant. And here is a picture of Grandpa and Grandma Pierce Jensen. There you go. And a picture of Grandma Jensen Pierce seated with her cousin when they both lived in Colonia Diaz, Mexico. And Grandpa and Grandma Riggin. There you go. And that's it. We'll see you.